The dusty Wyoming hotel clerk's lips curled into a sneer as he looked down at Professor Catherine Hartwell's application for the teaching position. "Ma'am, you're too educated for a frontier wife. No man out here wants a woman smarter than him." Catherine's green eyes flashed as she straightened to her full height. "Good thing I'm not here to be anyone's wife, sir. I'm here to teach your children to read, which, judging by that misspelled sign behind you, includes you." The crash from outside made everyone rush to the window. The tall cowboy who'd been eavesdropping had fallen clean off his horse, laughing so hard he couldn't stay mounted. The tall cowboy picked himself up from the dirt with surprising grace for a man who had just tumbled off his horse in the middle of Main Street, brushing dust from his leather chaps while his laughter still echoed off the wooden storefronts. Catherine stood frozen in the hotel doorway, her carpetbag still clutched in one hand, uncertain whether to be mortified or amused that her sharp tongue had caused such a spectacle. The cowboy was perhaps 35, with sun-weathered skin that spoke of years working under the Wyoming sky, broad shoulders that strained against his work shirt, and hands that looked capable of breaking wild horses or mending delicate things with equal skill. He strode toward her with a confident gait that made several townspeople step aside, his spurs chinking softly against the wooden boardwalk, and when he removed his hat in a gesture of respect, Catherine noticed his eyes were a startling grey blue, intelligent and warm, crinkling at the corners with genuine mirth. "Ma'am, I apologise for eavesdropping, but I have to thank you for the best laugh I have had in 2 years, he said, his voice a deep rumble that carried the faintest trace of Eastern education beneath the frontier drawl. "James Weston, though most folks call me West, owner of the Triple W Ranch about 7 miles north of town." Behind her, the hotel clerk sputtered something about not meaning any offence, that he was simply being honest about frontier life. But West turned his attention to the man with a raised eyebrow that made the clerk shrink visibly. "Chester, that sign behind you says, 'No rooms available,' which I believe is missing an A and has an extra L, so perhaps the professor here has a point about who needs the reading lessons." The clerk's face turned an impressive shade of crimson, while a few onlookers who had gathered to witness the commotion tried unsuccessfully to hide their snickers behind calloused hands. Catherine felt vindication bloom warm in her chest, sweet as honey after the bitter rejection from the school committee, but she also felt something else entirely as West's gaze returned to her with undisguised interest and what appeared to be respect. She had grown accustomed to men looking at her with confusion, irritation, or the particular condescension reserved for women who forgot their place, but this man looked at her like she was a fascinating puzzle he wanted to solve rather than a problem he needed to correct. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows down the dusty street, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, and Catherine was acutely aware of how she must appear after 3 days of travel by train and stagecoach, her green travelling dress rumpled despite her best efforts, her dark hair escaping its pins in ways that would have horrified her mother. "I am Catherine Hartwell," she said, lifting her chin in the way that had always made her father scowl, "and I was simply clarifying my purpose in Coldwater for Mr. Chester's benefit." West's smile widened, revealing straight white teeth that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance, and Catherine felt an unwelcome flutter in her stomach that she immediately tried to suppress, because she had not travelled 1,500 miles to be distracted by a charming cowboy, no matter how intelligent his eyes might be. Stay with me, friends, and comment your city below. I'm sharing this story from Denver, Colorado. Subscribe to my channel and let's see how far our story travels today. The Coldwater schoolhouse was a testament to the town's priorities, a weathered wooden structure with windows that rattled in their frames and floorboards that creaked protest with every step, looking more like an afterthought than a temple of learning as Catherine entered the following morning, with her credentials clutched in her gloved hands. The school committee, 5 men ranging from portly banker Silas Thornton to grizzled rancher Bill Hewitt, sat behind a table that appeared to have been borrowed from the saloon next door, their faces already set in expressions that told Catherine everything she needed to know before anyone spoke a word. "Miss Hartwell," Thornton began in the tone of a man explaining simple arithmetic to a slow child, "we have reviewed your application, and while your credentials are certainly impressive, we have decided to offer the position to Mr. Raymond Fletcher from Kansas." Catherine felt heat rise to her cheeks but kept her voice level as she asked why a man with 2 years of teaching experience was preferable to her 6 years at the Boston Female Academy, and Thornton leaned back in his chair with a satisfied air of a man who had anticipated this very question. "You see, Miss Hartwell, A woman of your qualifications would intimidate our simple community, he said, gesturing vaguely at the shabby room as if its condition proved his point. Our children need basic reading and arithmetic to run ranches and keep shop, not Latin and philosophy that will give them improper ideas above their station. Catherine's hands tightened on her portfolio until her knuckles went white, and she leaned forward with fire in her eyes that made two of the committee members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Education is precisely what allows people to rise above their station, gentlemen, she said, her voice carrying the passionate conviction that had gotten her dismissed from Boston in the first place. You speak of keeping children in their place as if ignorance were a virtue, but what you are really saying is that you fear what educated citizen might demand of their leaders, might expect of their communities, might become despite your low expectations. The men exchanged glances that spoke of shared masculine understanding, the kinds that dismissed female passion as hysteria rather than righteous anger, and Thornton stood to signal the meeting's end with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. The decision is made, Miss Hartwell, and I would suggest that a woman of your temperament might find frontier life unsuitable in any case, he said, smoothing his vest over his considerable belly. Perhaps you should consider returning east, where your particular talents might be better appreciated. Catherine opened her mouth to deliver a response that would likely have burned whatever bridges remained, but movement in the back of the room caught her attention, and she saw West Weston leaning against the doorframe, his expression unreadable but his presence oddly steadying. He had been there the whole time, she realized with a start, watching this humiliation unfold, and she could not decide whether that made everything better or infinitely worse as she gathered her materials with as much dignity as she could muster, and walked past the committee with her head high, feeling West's eyes follow her every step. Catherine made it 3 steps past the schoolhouse door before her composure cracked and she had to stop, pressing one hand against the rough wooden wall while she blinked back furious tears that she refused to let fall where anyone might see them. The morning sun was too bright, mocking her failure with cheerful warmth, and she was contemplating which direction led back to the hotel when boots sounded on the steps behind her, and West's voice said, "Miss Hartwell, might I have a word?" She turned to face him with her emotions barely contained, ready to tell him she was in no mood for pity or well-meaning platitudes. But the expression on his weathered face stopped the sharp words before they could form. He held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim in a gesture that seemed unconscious, and there was something vulnerable in his eyes that made him look less like the confident rancher who had mocked the hotel clerk and more like a man carrying a burden he could barely shoulder alone. "I have a proposition for you," he said, without preamble. "And before you think what every other woman in town would think hearing that from a bachelor rancher, let me be clear that this is a business arrangement." Catherine raised an eyebrow, her Boston breeding giving her a cool facade despite her internal turmoil, and crossed her arms in a posture that invited him to continue while promising nothing. "I have 3 children who are running wild without proper learning," West said, meeting her eyes directly in a way that felt like a test of her mettle. "Sarah is 11 and smart as a whip but hides it. Michael is 8 and struggles with his letters, and Emma just turned 4 and needs someone patient to start her education right. My wife died 2 years ago, bringing Emma into this world, and since then I have hired 3 tutors who could not manage the children, or did not stay once they realized how isolated the ranch is." Catherine studied him with the same analytical eye she had once used to evaluate philosophical arguments, looking for the trap or the ulterior motive because men simply did not seek out overeducated women unless they wanted something improper. "Why me, Mr. Weston?" she asked bluntly, letting her fatigue strip away the social niceties that usually govern such conversations. "You heard what Thornton said in there, that I am too qualified and too opinionated for frontier life, so why would you want someone like me teaching your children when you clearly run with the very men who just rejected me?" West's jaw tightened, and he looked away toward the mountains that rose purple in the distance, and when he spoke again his voice carried a weight of old pain that Catherine recognized because she carried her own. "My late wife could not read," he said simply, the words dropping like stones into still water. "Mary was kind and good and loved our children fiercer than a mother wolf, but she could not read the labels on medicine bottles or write letters to her sister back in Kansas or sign her own name to documents." He turned back to Catherine, and she saw moisture gleaming in his eyes that he did not try to hide. When she was dying, when the midwife finally admitted there was nothing more to be done, Mary had to sign her will with an X because she never learned to write her own name, and she made me promise that our children would never face that helplessness, would never be at the mercy of others because they lacked education. The hotel room was exactly as depressing as Catherine had expected. A cramped space with faded wallpaper peeling in the corners, and a narrow bed that sagged in the middle, like the back of an old horse, the single window looking out onto the alley where someone had left a pile of refuse that perfumed the air with an odour she tried not to identify. She sat on the edge of that sad bed and emptied her reticule onto the threadbare quilt, counting coins and crumpled bills with fingers that trembled slightly despite her attempts at composure, the arithmetic brutally simple and utterly damning. $23.40, enough for perhaps 6 more nights at this establishment if she ate sparingly and skipped breakfast, or enough for a train ticket back to Chicago with nothing left over for the final leg to Boston. Return to Boston meant crawling back to her father's house, where he would accept her only if she publicly admitted that her pursuit of education had been foolish. Female vanity meant enduring his lectures about wasted opportunities and unseemly ambition, meant watching her mother's disappointed face across the dinner table every evening, while her father reminded everyone that his daughter had thrown away her one chance at respectable marriage. Worse still, return meant confronting Professor Harold Whitmore, who had proposed marriage 3 times with increasing irritation at her refusals, who wanted a wife to grace his dinner parties and bear his children while he pursued serious academic work, who had actually said during his final proposal that her mind was impressive for a woman, but would be better applied to managing his household than wasting itself on teaching girls who would only become wives and mothers anyway. Catherine had slapped him for that comment, which had sealed her dismissal from the Boston Female Academy, where Harold served on the board of directors, and even now the memory of his shocked face brought her savage satisfaction despite the consequences that had followed. She stood and crossed to the window, looking past the alley to the mountains beyond, those massive purple peaks that made even her substantial problems feel small in comparison, and she thought about West's offer with the careful consideration she would give to any contract. The position meant isolation on a ranch 7 miles from town, meant living under the same roof as a widowed man, which would give the gossips endless entertainment, meant teaching children who had already driven away 3 tutors and might resent her as much as the school committee had. But it also meant a salary, meant purpose, meant the chance to prove that her education had value, even in this frontier town that wanted to keep its children safely ignorant and in their place. Catherine made her decision with the same clarity she had felt when boarding the train west 2 weeks ago, the same certainty that had made her leave Boston with her head high, despite the whispers following her down every street. She would accept West's position, but she would do it properly with a written contract that specified her salary and her working conditions, with clear boundaries that protected both her reputation and her independence, with terms that established her authority over educational matters and her right to separate quarters with a lock on the door. Samuel Brooks maintained a law office above the general store, a tidy room lined with leather-bound volumes that immediately told Catherine more about the man than any introduction could convey, and when West ushered her inside the following morning she was gratified to see surprise and then respect cross the lawyer's weathered face as she produced her own handwritten contract from her satchel. "Mr. Brooks, Mr. Weston, I have taken the liberty of drafting terms for this arrangement," Catherine said with the brisk efficiency she had learned from watching her father negotiate with hospital administrators, "and I would appreciate your review before we proceed further." West settled into the chair beside her rather than across the desk in the position of authority, which she noted with approval, and Brooks accepted her papers with the careful attention of a man who genuinely respected the law rather than merely profited from it. The terms were specific, and Catherine watched both men as they read, looking for the moment when masculine pride would assert itself and demand modifications that would diminish her position. Salary equal to that paid male teachers in the territory, private quarters with a door that locks from the inside, Sundays entirely free for personal pursuits, authority over all educational decisions regarding curriculum and methods, and access to any library on the premises for personal study, Brooks read aloud, his voice betraying nothing but professional interest. West looked up from the document and Catherine braced herself for objections, for the inevitable attempt to negotiate her down or insert clauses about proper feminine behaviour, but instead he simply asked if she had a pen. Brooks slid his inkwell across the desk and West signed his name, with a flourish that spoke of considerable practice, his handwriting surprisingly elegant for a man who worked with his hands, and then he reached for a fresh sheet of paper. "I would like to add 1 clause if Miss Hartwell agrees," West said, writing quickly before sliding the addendum toward her. "The tutor will provide evening instruction to James Weston 3 times weekly on subjects of mutual agreement. filling gaps in his education as she sees fit, with compensation included in the stated salary. Catherine read the addition twice, her mind racing through possible interpretations and hidden meanings, wondering if this was some elaborate seduction dressed in academic language. "What subjects did you have in mind, Mr. Weston?" she asked carefully. "And why would a successful rancher need evening lessons from a woman you have only just met?" West met her eyes with that same direct gaze that had unsettled her outside the schoolhouse, and she saw no deception there, only a hunger for knowledge that she recognized because she had spent her entire life feeling that same desperate need. "I can read and cipher well enough for business, but my education has considerable gaps," he said simply. "History beyond what I learned in the war, philosophy, literature, mathematics beyond basic accounting, all the things a man is supposed to learn at university but which I missed by choosing a different path." Brooks was definitely hiding a smile now, his lips pressed together as he made a show of examining the contract amendments, and Catherine realized the lawyer found this entire negotiation entertaining in a way that suggested he knew West better than most. She considered the addition carefully, turning it over in her mind like a specimen under a microscope, examining it for flaws or dangers. Teaching West in the evenings meant more time in his company, meant a different kind of intimacy than the formal distance of employer and employee, meant opportunities for either intellectual satisfaction or complete disaster depending on his true character and intentions. The Triple W Ranch sprawled across a valley between two ridges like something from a painting. The main house built of timber and stone with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 titis, barns and outbuildings arranged with military precision, and pastures stretching toward mountains that rose so tall they seemed to scrape the belly of heaven itself. Catherine sat beside West in the wagon as they approached, her travelling trunk secured in the back, and she could see immediately that while the ranch was prosperous and well-maintained, it lacked the softening touches that marked a woman's presence. No curtains in the windows, no flowers planted near the porch, no colourful quilts airing in the afternoon sun. 3 children tumbled out of the house as the wagon pulled to a stop, and Catherine's first thought was that they looked like wild things barely contained by civilization. All 3 wearing clothes that were clean but ill-fitting, as though no one had noticed they were growing. The eldest, Sarah, had her father's grey eyes and dark hair pulled back in a braid that was already coming loose, her expression one of careful assessment that reminded Catherine uncomfortably of how she herself had looked at the world at that age, suspicious and guarded and too smart for her own comfort. Michael was all energy and angles, a boy on the edge of that transformation into young man, with freckles scattered across his nose and dirt under his fingernails that suggested he had been doing something interesting before being summoned to meet the new tutor. Little Emma hid behind her father's legs the moment West lifted her down from the wagon, peering at Catherine, with huge brown eyes that held the kind of wariness that broke something in Catherine's chest because no 4-year-old should look at the world with such careful fear. "Children, this is Miss Catherine Hartwell who will be teaching you starting tomorrow," West said with gentle firmness, "and I expect you to show her the same respect you would show me." The children stared at Catherine with expressions ranging from Sarah's cool challenge to Michael's uncertain curiosity to Emma's silent evaluation, and Catherine realized with sinking certainty that winning these 3 over would be far harder than arguing with any school committee. The front door opened again and a woman emerged, round and warm-looking, with silver threading through her black hair, wearing a simple dress and an apron dusted with flour, her face creasing into genuine welcome that felt like water in a desert. "Señorita Hartwell, I am Rosie Delgado, the housekeeper, and I am very pleased to meet you," the woman said, with only the faintest accent colouring her English. "I have prepared the room at the end of the hall for you, the one with the best light for reading, and there is stew for dinner when you are settled." Catherine felt something in her chest loosen slightly at this kindness, at finding one ally in this strange new world, and as West showed her inside and up the stairs to her quarters, she looked out the window at the vast landscape surrounding them, and felt the strangest sensation of being simultaneously trapped and freed, isolated from everything she had known, but also released from all the expectations that had caged her in Boston. Catherine had anticipated resistance, but nothing quite prepared her for the coordinated campaign of sabotage that greeted her first lesson in the small parlour West had designated as their schoolroom, a bright space with windows overlooking the pastures and a large oak table that would serve as their workspace. Sarah sat with her arms crossed and a mutinous expression that would have done credit to a revolutionary. Michael fidgeted with barely contained energy that suggested he might explode at any moment, and Emma clutched a rag doll to her chest while eyeing Catherine with the desperate look of a cornered animal. Catherine began with simple questions about what they had learned from previous tutors, and Sarah proceeded to give deliberately wrong answers with such conviction that Catherine almost admired the performance, declaring that Columbus discovered America in 1776 and that the capital of the United States was located in Texas. When Catherine asked Michael to read a simple passage from a primer, he somehow managed to knock over the inkwell in a movement that looked accidental but was clearly calculated, black liquid spreading across Catherine's carefully prepared notes and dripping onto her second-best dress. Emma took this opportunity to burst into tears and wail for her papa, her small voice echoing through the house with impressive volume for such a tiny child, and Catherine heard boots in the hallway that suggested West was about to intervene. She held up one hand to stop him without even looking at the door, keeping her attention focused on the children, and took a deep breath that settled the fury rising in her chest because losing her temper would mean losing any chance of earning their respect. "Sarah, you are clearly very intelligent. So why do you think someone might want others to believe they are less smart than they truly are?" Catherine asked in a conversational tone, abandoning her ruined notes and leaning back in her chair. Sarah blinked, surprised by the question, and Catherine saw the exact moment the girl realized she had been caught in her own trap, her cheeks flushing as she tried to maintain her defiant posture. "Michael, that was actually a very creative way to express your feelings about reading lessons," Catherine continued, turning to the boy with a smile that was genuine despite the ink now staining her cuff. "Perhaps instead of traditional primers we might find books about things that interest you, like ranch work or horses or whatever, captures your imagination." She moved to Emma then, kneeling down to the child's level and pulling a pencil from her pocket along with a scrap of paper that had survived the ink disaster, and began sketching quickly while the little girl's sobs subsided into hiccups of curiosity. "This is an A for alligator," Catherine said, drawing a creature with a long snout and sharp teeth. "And this is a B for bear. Do you like animals, Miss Emma?" The child nodded slowly and reached out one small finger to touch the drawing, and Catherine added whiskers to the bear, which made Emma giggle, a sound like bells that transformed her frightened face into something sweet and open. From the doorway, West watched with an expression Catherine caught in her peripheral vision, something between relief and admiration and hope, and when Sarah finally muttered that Catherine was not as stupid as she had hoped, Catherine counted it as her first real victory in this strange new territory. The study was smaller than Catherine had expected, but lined floor to ceiling with books that made her heart leap with the greedy joy of a scholar finding treasure, and when West joined her after tucking Emma into bed for the third time, Catherine had already pulled down a volume of Plato and was preparing a basic literacy assessment in her mind. She gestured for him to sit across from her at the desk, her teacher's instincts arranging them in positions of instructor and pupil, but West surprised her by moving his chair to sit beside her instead, close enough that she could smell leather and soap and something earthy that was simply him. "I should confess before we begin that I may have misrepresented my educational needs slightly," he said, and the hint of mischief in his eyes made Catherine narrow her own in suspicion. "I can read perfectly well, as you will discover, but I want to understand what I read beyond the simple mechanics of decoding words on a page." Catherine felt a flush of something that might have been irritation, or might have been intrigue, as she opened the Plato and found it marked with notes in the margins, observations in the same elegant hand that had signed her contract, questions and arguments scribbled beside passages about the nature of justice and the ideal state. "You have been studying philosophy on your own," she said, and it was not quite a question, but not quite an accusation either, more an attempt to understand this man who kept surprising her at every turn. West leaned back and studied the ceiling as though organising his thoughts, and when he spoke his voice carried the weight of confession, of sharing something he rarely exposed to others. "I was a cavalry officer during the war, Union side, and spent 3 years moving through Virginia and Tennessee watching boys die for causes they barely understood," he said. "I started stealing books from abandoned plantation libraries, carrying them in my saddle. Bags like some men carried Bibles or letters from sweethearts, reading by campfire light while other officers played cards or drank whiskey." Catherine found herself leaning forward, drawn into his story despite her intention to maintain professional distance, and she asked what he had read, what had captured his attention while surrounded by death and destruction. Everything I could find, philosophy, history, mathematics, treatises, I bet they understood. Poetry that seemed obscene in its beauty when compared to the ugliness around us, West said, and his eyes focused on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. I taught myself calculus from a water-damaged textbook I found in a burned-out schoolhouse, learned Greek from a grammar book with half its pages missing, read Mill and Kant and Hegel, and argued with dead men in my head because there was no one alive who wanted to discuss whether utilitarianism could justify the war we were fighting. They began with epistemology because Catherine wanted to test the depth of his understanding, and within minutes she realised that West was not merely educated but genuinely brilliant. His mind quick and flexible, able to grasp complex arguments and counter them with examples drawn from his own experience rather than simply parroting what he had read. The Coldwater Methodist Church was a whitewashed building, with wooden pews worn smooth by decades of fidgeting congregants, and Catherine felt every eye turned toward her when she entered with West and the children on her first Sunday at the ranch, the whispers starting before she had even taken her seat. She wore her best dress, a deep burgundy silk that had survived the journey west better than most of her wardrobe, and had pinned her hair with extra care, but she knew that no amount of respectability in her appearance would silence the wagging tongues that saw scandal in every unconventional arrangement. The Weston family sat in their usual pew near the front, Sarah on one side of Catherine and Emma pressed against her other side in a display of possessiveness that warmed Catherine's heart even as it probably fueled the gossip. And Michael sat beside his father, swinging his legs until West's hand on his shoulder stilled the movement. Reverend Walsh delivered a sermon about the Good Samaritan that seemed pointed given the circumstances, but Catherine barely heard the words because she was too aware of the whispers behind her, women's voices that thought they were being discreet but carried clearly in the small space. Living right there in his house with those children and no chaperone, that is not proper no matter what contract they signed, one voice hissed, and another responded that educated women always thought rules did not apply to them, that they were above common decency. Catherine's spine stiffened, but she kept her eyes forward, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her react, and she felt West shift beside her as though he too had heard, and was restraining himself from turning around to confront the speakers. After the service, as the congregation filed out to exchange pleasantries in the churchyard, Catherine overheard Mrs. Thornton holding court near the steps, her considerable bulk blocking the path while she pronounced judgment on the moral state of the community. "Educated women are dangerous," Mrs. Thornton declared in a voice meant to carry. "They give other women improper ideas about their station in life, make them dissatisfied with the roles God intended for them." West, who had been helping Emma down the steps, stopped so abruptly that Michael nearly ran into him, and Catherine watched his jaw clench in a way that suggested he was about to say something that would make the situation significantly worse. "Mr. Thornton, Mrs. Thornton," West said in a voice that cut through the murmuring crowd like a knife through butter. "Miss Hartwell is employed at my ranch as a tutor for my children, and conducts herself with complete propriety under the watchful eye of my housekeeper, Mrs. Delgado, and I will thank you not to impugn her character or my judgment in hiring the most qualified educator available." The churchyard went silent, everyone frozen in tableau like actors on a stage, and Mrs. Thornton's face flushed an ugly red that clashed with her purple dress. But before she could respond, a younger woman stepped forward from the crowd. Catherine recognised her as Margaret Hayes, who ran the general store with her husband, a woman perhaps 5 years older than Catherine with work-roughened hands and intelligence in her eyes. "Miss Hartwell, I wonder if you might have time this week to discuss some books for my daughter," Margaret said clearly. Ignoring the gasps from the older women, "I hear you have access to quite an extensive library, and I would value your recommendations." Catherine found the journal quite by accident a week into her tenure at the ranch, lying open on the window seat in the parlour where Sarah had apparently been working before being called away to help with some ranch emergency, and what Catherine saw on those pages made her stop in her tracks with her breath catching in her throat. The equations were advanced, far beyond anything an 11-year-old should know, complex algebraic formulas mixed with geometric proofs that showed not just rote memorization, but genuine understanding of mathematical principles that most university students struggle to grasp. Catherine sat down slowly, her teaching instincts warring with respect for privacy, but the work was simply too extraordinary to ignore, and when Sarah returned 20 minutes later to find Catherine studying the journal, the girl's face went through a series of expressions that ended in resignation mixed with defiance. I suppose you will tell Papa now, and he will think I am unnatural, Sarah said, reaching for the journal. But Catherine held it just out of reach, her eyes still scanning the elegant equations that filled page after page. Sarah, this work is remarkable. Where did you learn calculus and geometric proofs? Catherine asked, and the genuine admiration in her voice seemed to confuse the girl, who had clearly been bracing for criticism or mockery. The former tutor, Mr. Pemberton, had books he did not think I noticed, Sarah admitted, sinking into the chair across from Catherine with the defeated posture of someone confessing a crime. I borrowed them at night and taught myself, but when he caught me working through problems, he said that girls who are too smart never find husbands, that men do not want wives who are cleverer than they are, and that I should focus on accomplishments that would make me marriageable like needlework and watercolours. Catherine felt rage bloom hot in her chest at this Mr. Pemberton who had tried to dim such a bright light, and she set the journal down carefully before speaking in a voice that trembled slightly with the force of her emotion. Sarah, I was told the exact same thing when I was not much older than you are now, that my intelligence was unmarriageable, that no man would want a wife who could argue philosophy or discuss mathematics, that I should hide my mind like some shameful secret. The girl looked up sharply, her grey eyes so like her father's searching Catherine's face for signs of deception or pity. And Catherine continued with brutal honesty about her own experiences, about being dismissed from positions for being too educated, about her father's disappointment that she pursued learning instead of marriage, about coming west because Boston had no place for a woman who refused to make herself smaller. You are not unnatural, Sarah, you are gifted, and any man who cannot appreciate your mind is not worth having, Catherine said firmly, and then added with a slight smile, though I should note that your father specifically hired me because he values education, so perhaps not all men are as foolish as Mr. Pemberton suggested. They spent the next hour working through problems together, Catherine challenging Sarah with increasingly difficult equations, and watching with joy as the girl's face lit up with the pleasure of intellectual engagement. And when Sarah finally asked in a small voice whether Catherine had come to Wyoming to hide too, Catherine found herself answering with an honesty that surprised them both, admitting that yes, perhaps she had been hiding, but that she was learning there was a difference between hiding from the world and finding a place where you could finally be yourself. The crisis came at midnight when Catherine was already in her nightgown preparing for bed, the frantic pounding on her door followed by West's urgent voice saying they needed her in the barn immediately. His prize-breeding mare was in trouble, and Tom the ranch hand who knew veterinary medicine had gone to town and would not be back until morning. Catherine threw her wrapper over her nightclothes and followed West into the cold October night, her bare feet thrust into boots that were far too large, and when they reached the barn she found the mare lying on her side in the straw, her belly distended and her eyes rolling white with pain and fear. "The foal is breech," West said, his voice tight with controlled panic as he knelt beside the struggling animal, "and I cannot turn it. I have tried, but my hands are too large and I am afraid of hurting her worse." Catherine dropped to her knees without thinking, her mind already cataloguing what she knew from the anatomy and biology courses she had taken at the academy. Lectures on mammalian reproduction that had scandalized half her classmates, but which she had found fascinating in their clinical detail. Her father had believed that women who might become mothers should understand the mechanics of birth even if society found such knowledge unseemly. And she had assisted him once with a similar situation involving a farmer's cow, the principles surely being similar even if the scale was different. "Talk me through what you have tried," Catherine said, rolling up her sleeves and moving to examine the mare, and West described his attempts to reach inside and reposition the foal with hands that were indeed too large for such delicate work. Catherine's hands were smaller, her fingers longer and more nimble, and she closed her eyes to visualize what the textbooks had taught her about fetal positioning and the mechanics of live birth. She reached inside the mare with West guiding her, telling her what he felt when he had tried, and her fingers found the foal's legs tangled in a way that prevented natural delivery, one hoof caught against the pelvis in a position that could kill both mother and baby if not corrected. The next 20 minutes were a blur of intense concentration, Catherine following instinct and half-remembered lessons while West held the mare's head and murmured soothing words, and when she finally felt the foal shift into proper position and begin to emerge, she let out a sob of relief that surprised her with its intensity. The foal slid free in a rush of fluid and membrane, a perfect little creature that lay still for one terrifying moment before shuddering to life and taking its first gasping breath, and the mare nickered weakly and turned her head to nuzzle her baby with the fierce protective love that transcended species. Catherine sat back on her heels, covered in blood and amniotic fluid and bits of straw, her nightgown ruined beyond repair and her hair falling from its braid, and she felt more alive than she had in years, more useful and necessary and real than all her years of teaching abstract philosophy to bored students. West was staring at her with an expression she could not quite read, something between gratitude and wonder, and a heat that made her acutely aware of how improper this situation was. The two of them alone in a barn in the middle of the night with her barely dressed, and him looking at her like she had hung the moon. "You're full of surprises, Professor," he said quietly, and Catherine heard in those simple words a shift in how he saw her, a recognition that went beyond employer and employee, or even teacher and student, something deeper and infinitely more dangerous to the careful boundary years she had drawn around her heart. Silas Thornton arrived at the Triple W Ranch 3 days after the Sunday church incident, driving a gleaming black buggy that looked absurdly out of place against the rough frontier landscape, his considerable bulk shifting with difficulty as he climbed down without waiting for the invitation or welcome. West was working with a young stallion in the corral when the banker appeared, and Catherine watched from the schoolroom window as the two men faced each other with the kind of tension that precedes either violence or negotiation, though she suspected Thornton was too cowardly for the former and too arrogant to engage in the latter honestly. She could not hear their conversation from her position, but she saw West's posture change from relaxed to rigid, saw his hands clench into fists at his sides, and when he gestured sharply toward the house, Catherine knew with sinking certainty that she was the subject of their discussion. Thornton followed West into the parlour where Catherine had been reviewing Sarah's mathematics work, and the banker's piggy eyes swept over her with undisguised contempt mixed with something that might have been fear, as though her mere presence threatened the natural order of his carefully controlled world. "Miss Hartwell, I have come to discuss a matter of business with Mr. Weston, but perhaps it concerns you as well," Thornton said, settling his bulk into a chair that creaked protest under his weight. "I have been approached by certain territorial officials who have expressed concern about Mr. Weston's suitability for the government contracts he currently holds for breeding cavalry horses, concerns raised by reports of inappropriate conduct at his ranch." Catherine felt ice form in her stomach but kept her expression neutral, while West's face darkened with barely controlled fury, as Thornton continued with the smooth malice of a man who enjoyed wielding power over others. "It seems that having an unmarried woman of questionable morals living under your roof has raised eyebrows in certain circles," Thornton said, examining his fingernails with studied casualness. "These officials wonder if a man who shows such poor judgment in his personal affairs can be trusted with important government business, and I have been asked to convey their concerns and offer a simple solution." Catherine knew what was coming before Thornton spoke the words, had seen this pattern before in Boston, where men who felt threatened by female intelligence used social pressure and economic coercion to enforce conformity. If Miss Hartwell were to leave your employment and return east where she belongs, these concerns would naturally disappear and your contracts would be secure, Thornton said, and then his eyes shifted to Catherine with calculated cruelty. Of course, if she refuses to leave voluntarily, there are other methods of encouraging her departure, ways of making life in Coldwater quite uncomfortable for a woman of her peculiar situation. West took one step toward Thornton, his hand moving to his belt where Catherine knew he sometimes carried a gun, and his voice when he spoke was soft and deadly in a way that made even Thornton shift nervously in his chair. "Get off my property," West said, each word dropping like stones into deep water, "and if you ever threaten Miss Hartwell again or attempt to interfere with her employment, I will make it my personal mission to expose every fraudulent deal you have made, every family you have cheated, every penny you have stolen through usurious interest rates." Michael had been struggling with the same primer for 2 weeks, his frustration mounting with each failed attempt to decode the stilted sentences about Dick and Jane and their adventures that bore no resemblance to life on a Wyoming ranch. And Catherine finally abandoned the book entirely in favour of an approach that would have scandalised her former colleagues at the Boston Female Academy. She took Michael outside to the barn where West was working, gathered scraps of wood and a piece of charcoal and began writing words directly on the barn boards. Simple words like horse and hay and saddle, each one connected to something Michael could touch and understand with his hands as well as his mind. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday afternoon when Michael suddenly stopped in the middle of struggling through a word and his whole face transformed, the confusion clearing like clouds parting to reveal sun, and he sounded out ranch with a confidence that made Catherine's heart soar with the particular joy that only teachers know when witnessing the moment a student truly understands. They spent the rest of the afternoon writing sentences together about ranch life, Michael choosing the words he wanted to learn because they mattered to him, because they described his world rather than some foreign existence of city children and their incomprehensible games, and by evening he'd composed his first complete sentence entirely on his own, printing it carefully onto a slate with his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. At dinner that night, Michael could barely contain his excitement, bouncing in his chair while Sarah rolled her eyes in pretend annoyance, and Emma watched her brother with wide, curious eyes, and when West asked what had made him so energetic, Michael thrust the slate toward his father with pride blazing on his freckled face. "My papa is the best rancher in Wyoming," West read aloud, his voice catching slightly on the words, and Catherine watched his expression transform as the meaning of what had happened truly registered. His son, who had struggled for so long, had finally broken through the barrier that separated the literate from the illiterate, the empowered from the helpless. West set down the slate with hands that trembled slightly, and pulled Michael into a fierce embrace that made the boy squirm with embarrassment and pleasure in equal measure, and when West looked up his eyes were bright with tears that he made no attempt to hide. "Mary would have been so proud," he said, his voice rough with emotion, and Catherine remembered him telling her about his wife's dying wish that their children be educated, that they never face the helplessness she had known. Sarah reached over to squeeze Catherine's hand under the table, a gesture of gratitude and connection that spoke volumes about how far they had come in just a few weeks, and even Emma clapped her small hands together and announced that she wanted to learn to read too so she could write about her papa. Catherine felt something shift in her chest as she looked around the table at these three children who'd been so determined to reject her and were now blooming under her care, and she realized with startling clarity that she was not simply teaching them academic subjects, she was helping to heal wounds left by loss and grief, filling spaces that had been empty for too long, becoming something she had never intended to be but which felt more right than anything she had done before. They had been studying Wordsworth for nearly an hour, the study illuminated only by lamplight that cast shadows dancing across the walls and turned Catherine's hair to burnished copper where it had begun to escape its pins, and West had moved his chair progressively closer as they discussed the Romantic poets and their rebellion against classical forms until their shoulders were nearly touching. Catherine was explaining her theory about how Wordsworth's nature imagery reflected a longing for primal connection in an increasingly industrialized world, her hands gesturing as she spoke with the animation that always overtook her when discussing literature, and she did not notice how West had stopped looking at the book and was instead watching her face with an expression that would have warned her if she had been paying attention. They leaned over a particular passage simultaneously, their heads bending close to examine a complex metaphor about daffodils and memory, and Catherine became suddenly aware of how near he was, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his grey eyes and count his eyelashes and feel the warmth radiating from his body into the cool evening air. Her breath caught, and whatever scholarly point she had been making died on her lips as West reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and cupped her face with one calloused hand that was surprisingly gentle against her cheek. "Catherine, he began, his voice rough with emotion and something that might have been longing, and she found herself leaning into his touch despite every rational, thought screaming that this was dangerous, that she had come here to escape exactly this kind of vulnerability, that falling for her employer was the height of foolishness for a woman in her precarious position. His thumb traced her cheekbone with reverent care, and his eyes searched hers for permission, or perhaps reassurance, and Catherine felt her carefully constructed walls crumbling like sandcastles before the tide as she tilted her face up toward his and let her eyes drift closed. The moment shattered when Emma's scream pierced the quiet house, a sound of pure terror that had West on his feet and moving toward the stairs before Catherine could even process what had happened, and she was left sitting alone in the study, with her heart hammering against her ribs and her hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the desk. She could hear West's voice through the ceiling, low and soothing, as he comforted Emma through whatever nightmare had seized her, and Catherine pressed her fingers to her cheek where she could still feel the ghost of his touch burning like a brand. This was not supposed to happen, she thought, with something close to panic. She had fled Boston to escape the trap of romance and marriage, had accepted this position precisely because it seemed safe and professional, a way to use her education without surrendering her independence to some man who would try to dim her light or reshape her into something more acceptable. But West was not like the men who had tried to court her in Boston with their patronizing compliments and their assumption that marriage meant she would abandon her mind in favor of domestic duties. West argued philosophy with her as an equal, encouraged Sarah's brilliance instead of trying to suppress it, valued Catherine's knowledge and skills without feeling threatened by them. The letter arrived on a Tuesday with the weekly mail delivery, addressed in handwriting that made Catherine's stomach clench with recognition before she even broke the wax seal, and when she unfolded the thick cream paper, she found exactly the condescension she had expected written in Harold Whitmore's precise academic script. "My dear Catherine," it began, as though they were on intimate terms rather than bitter adversaries, "I have learned through mutual acquaintances of your current situation in that frontier wilderness, and I write to offer you an opportunity to return to civilization and respectability." Harold went on to explain that he was willing to overlook her willful disobedience in refusing his previous proposals, willing to forgive her unseemly flight from Boston, willing to accept her despite the scandal that had followed her dismissal from the academy, all phrased as though he were bestowing tremendous favour rather than revealing himself as the pompous fool he had always been. He wrote that her radical ideas about female intellectual equality had been the result of youthful enthusiasm that would naturally fade once she experienced the steadying influence of marriage and motherhood, that her proper place was as his wife, where her education could be applied to raising their children and managing his household, rather than corrupting impressionable young minds with dangerous notions about women's capabilities. Catherine read the letter twice, each reading stoking her fury higher until her hands shook with the force of her rage, and then she carried it to the kitchen stove where a fire was burning low and fed the pages one by one into the flames. She was watching Harold's words curl and blacken when West entered through the back door, his boots muddy from working in the pastures, and he stopped short at the expression on her face. "What's wrong?" he asked with the directness she had come to appreciate, and Catherine found herself unable to maintain the careful privacy she usually guarded, the emotions churned up by Harold's letter breaking through her defences like flood water through a dam. She told West everything then, the whole ugly story she had kept locked away since arriving in Wyoming, how she had been teaching at the Boston Female Academy, and had dared to suggest in her philosophy classes that women possessed the same intellectual capabilities as men and deserved equal access to education and professional opportunities. The board of directors, led by Harold, who served as their chairman, had been scandalized by what they termed her corrupting influence on young minds, worried that she was filling students with improper ambitions that would make them unfit for marriage and motherhood, and they had dismissed her with a letter of censure that made finding other teaching positions impossible. Her father, a prominent Boston physician who had initially supported her education, had been so humiliated by the scandal that he had disowned her publicly, declaring that she had brought shame on the family name with her unwomanly pursuits and radical ideas, and he had told her she was no longer welcome in his house unless she married Harold and submitted to proper feminine behaviour. West was silent for a long moment after Catherine finished her story, staring at the stove where the last traces of Harold's letter was turning to ash, and when he finally spoke his voice was tight with controlled fury. "That fool let the most remarkable woman I have ever met slip away," he said, turning to face her fully. "His loss is my gain, though I suspect he will never understand what he threw aside when he tried to diminish you to fit his narrow idea of what a woman should be." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes at the simple declaration, at being called remarkable by a man who actually understood what the word meant, who had spent weeks debating philosophy with her, and encouraging her students and treating her intelligence as an asset rather than a liability. West took a step closer and she saw in his face the same expression he had worn that interrupted night in the study, something between longing and determination, and her heart began to race with equal parts hope and terror. "Catherine, I know we agreed to keep this professional, to maintain appropriate boundaries, but I cannot pretend any more," he said carefully, as though choosing each word with the precision he applied to breaking horses or negotiating contracts. "You're not just my children's teacher. You're not just an employee I hired to fill a need. You are—" he paused, seeming to gather courage. "You are the woman I think about when I wake in the morning and the last thought I have before sleep. The person I want to share every discovery and debate and quiet moment with, and I am falling in love with you if I have not already fallen completely." Catherine held up one hand as though she could physically stop the words that terrified her, more than any threat from Thornton or letter from Harold, because those were external dangers she could fight against. But this was something internal and infinitely more dangerous to the independence she had fought so hard to claim. "I cannot be the woman who needs rescuing again," she said, and heard her voice shake despite her efforts at control. "I came here to stand on my own, to prove that I have value beyond what marriage might give me, to build a life that is mine rather than something granted by a man's approval or protection." West did not try to touch her, though she could see the effort it cost him to maintain distance, and his eyes never left her face as he listened with the same careful attention he gave to everything she said. "You have never needed rescuing, Catherine," he said quietly, but with absolute conviction. "From the moment you stepped off that stage and put Chester in his place, from the day you walked into that school committee meeting and refused to back down, from every single interaction I have witnessed, you have been the one doing the saving, not the one being saved." He gestured toward the ceiling where the children slept peacefully for the first time in months. "You saved Sarah from hiding her brilliance. You saved Michael from believing he was stupid. You saved Emma from the fear that had been consuming her since Mary died. And you have been saving me from the half-life I was living, going through motions without purpose or joy or hope for anything beyond simple survival." The territorial education inspector arrived without warning on a cold November morning when frost still painted the windows white, and Catherine was in the middle of teaching Emma her letters, the sound of hooves on the frozen ground the only announcement before a sharp knock rattled the front door. Wickham was exactly the type of man Catherine had learned to dread during her years in academia, thin and rigid with disapproval radiating from every line of his body, his wire-rimmed spectacles perched on a narrow nose that seemed designed specifically for looking down at others, and when West opened the door the inspector did not wait for his invitation before stepping inside and announcing his purpose. "I'm here to investigate reports of irregularities in the educational arrangements at this establishment," Wickham said in a voice that matched his appearance, clipped and precise and utterly without warmth. "I will require immediate access to all relevant documentation, including the credentials of the so-called teacher, examples of curriculum and lesson plans, and private interviews with each child to assess their actual learning versus what has been claimed." Catherine rose from where she had been sitting with Emma, her heart hammering against her ribs but her face calm with the composure she had learned to maintain under hostile scrutiny, and she gestured toward the study where her certificates from the Boston Female Academy were stored, along with her carefully kept records of each child's progress. West looked ready to throw the inspector out bodily, but Catherine caught his eye and gave a tiny shake of her head, because violence would only confirm whatever suspicions Thornton had planted, would give Wickham exactly the ammunition he needed to declare the situation inappropriate and demand her removal. The inspection lasted 3 hours that felt like 3 years, Wickham examining every document with the thoroughness of a man hoping to find fraud, questioning Catherine's teaching methods with barely concealed skepticism, suggesting that her approach of connecting lessons to practical ranch activities was unorthodox and possibly damaging to proper educational development. Catherine answered each question with professional precision, explained her pedagogical philosophy with the same clarity she had once used in defending her thesis, presented examples of the children's work that showed remarkable progress in just 6 weeks under her instruction. But she could see in Wickham's eyes that no amount of evidence would sway a man who had already decided she was unsuitable based on nothing more than her gender and unmarried status. The separate interviews with the children were the worst part because Catherine could not be present to guide or protect them, could only wait in the parlour while Wickham closeted himself with each child in turn and asked questions she could only imagine, and she found herself praying to a God she was not entirely sure she believed in, that Sarah would control her tongue, that Michael would not be too nervous to demonstrate his reading, that Emma would not be frightened into silence by this stern stranger. West paced the parlour like a caged wolf, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, and Catherine wanted to tell him that everything would be fine but could not force the lie past her lips because she was terrified in a way she had not been even when facing the school committee or Thornton's threats. Terrified of losing not just employment but the place that had somehow become home in ways Boston never had. The children who had become hers in all but blood. The man who had looked at her like she was remarkable and meant it. Sarah was the first to be interviewed, and Catherine could hear raised voices through the study door, the girls' passionate tones cutting through Wickham's attempts at condescending questions, and when they emerged 20 minutes later, Sarah's face was flushed with righteous anger, while Wickham looked distinctly unsettled. Michael went next and came out beaming with pride, whispering to Catherine that he had read 3 whole pages from a book about horses without stumbling once, and even Emma, who Catherine had feared would be too frightened to speak, returned from her interview with a pleased expression that suggested something had gone well. West was called in last to answer questions about the household arrangements, and Catherine was left alone with the children, her hands twisted together in her lap while she tried to interpret every creak of floorboard and murmur of voice from behind the closed door. When Wickham finally emerged with West following, his expression was complicated, impressed, warring with disapproval in a way that suggested his prejudices were fighting against actual evidence, and he settled into a chair in the parlour before delivering his preliminary findings. "Miss Hartwell, I must confess that the children's educational progress exceeds anything I expected to find in such an irregular situation," he said, and Catherine felt hope fear there in her chest despite his tone. Young Sarah demonstrated mathematical abilities that would be remarkable in a university student, worked through geometric proofs and algebraic equations that I myself found challenging to follow, and when I expressed surprise at her knowledge, she informed me quite forcefully that you taught her that being smart is not something to hide, and that you are the best teacher in the whole territory. Wickham's lips pressed together, in a way that suggested he did not entirely approve of such passionate declarations from young girls, but he continued his assessment with grudging fairness. Michael read complex passages with comprehension and enthusiasm, explaining the content in ways that showed genuine understanding rather than rote memorization, and even the youngest child recited poetry by Wordsworth, with expression that indicated she grasps meaning beyond simple repetition of words. Catherine's throat tightened with emotion at hearing her students defended, at knowing they had stood up for her in the face of this intimidating authority figure, and she saw West's hand move as though he wanted to reach for hers, before remembering propriety and letting it fall. However, Wickham continued, and Catherine felt her hope falter at that single damning word. "I cannot ignore the irregularity of the living situation. An unmarried woman residing under the same roof as a widowed man, with no female relative present to provide proper chaperoning. And while Mrs. Delgado serves as housekeeper, she does not live in the main house, and therefore cannot adequately supervise the moral propriety of the arrangement." Catherine wanted to scream that her morals were none of his concern, that the contract she had signed specified separate quarters and professional boundaries, that she had done nothing improper and neither had West. But she bit her tongue because emotional outbursts would only confirm whatever suspicions Wickham harboured about unsuitable women and their ungoverned passions. Margaret Hayes appeared at the ranch 3 days after Wickham's inspection, driving her own wagon with a determination that suggested this was no social call. And when Catherine met her at the door, Margaret glanced around as though checking for eavesdroppers before speaking in a low, urgent voice. "Miss Hartwell, there are some women in town who would like to speak with you privately, and I wondered if you might come to my store this evening after closing, say around 7 o'clock when the street is quiet." Catherine agreed despite her confusion, and that evening she rode into town with West serving as escort, though he remained outside with the horses, while she slipped through the back entrance of the general store into a room that was crowded with perhaps a dozen women ranging in age from barely 20 to well past 50. Margaret stood at the front of the group, and Catherine recognised most of the faces from church, ranch wives whose husbands worked land similar to West's, women with work-roughened hands and tired eyes who looked at Catherine with a mixture of hope and desperation that made her heart clench. "Miss Hartwell, we have been watching what you do with the children at the Western Ranch," Margaret began, "and we have seen Sarah Hayes reading books that would challenge most men, Michael writing his own stories, even little Emma reciting poetry, and we want what you are giving them." Catherine felt confused because surely these women could read. Most frontier communities had basic schools, even if they were inadequate. But then a younger woman named Beth Peterson stepped forward with her cheeks flaming red. "I can read some, Miss Hartwell, enough to get by with simple things, but I cannot read the medical books that might tell me how to help my children when they are sick, cannot understand the newspapers my husband brings from Denver, cannot write letters to my sister in Ohio without asking my husband to correct my spelling like I'm a child." One by one, the women shared their stories of educations cut short by necessity or poverty, or parents who believed girls needed only enough learning to manage households, of husbands who discouraged reading because it gave wives ideas above their station, of hunger for knowledge that had been suppressed for so long it had become a physical ache. "We want you to teach us," Margaret said firmly, "not just reading and writing, though some of us need help with that, but mathematics so we can keep our own accounts and know if merchants are cheating us, history so we understand the world beyond our ranches, science and philosophy, and all the things men learn at university and think we are too simple to grasp. Catherine felt something expand in her chest, a sense of purpose that went beyond teaching children or even defending her own position, and she realized with sudden clarity that she had started something bigger than herself, a quiet revolution that could transform this entire community if given the chance. "We will have to meet secretly," Margaret continued, "because most of our husbands would disapprove, would say we are neglecting our duties or getting improper ideas, but we are willing to take that risk if you are willing to teach us." Thornton discovered his wife's betrayal on a Wednesday evening when he came home early from the bank to find her gone, and a neighbour's child reported seeing Mrs. Thornton entering the back of the general store with several other women. And when he investigated, he found his wife of 20 years sitting in a circle with ranch wives listening to Catherine explain the principles of accounting and financial management. The banker's face had turned purple with rage, according to Margaret, who witnessed the scene, and he had dragged Mrs. Thornton from the store by her arm while shouting that Catherine Hartwell was corrupting the morals of decent women and turning wives against their husbands with her radical Eastern ideas. 2 days later, West received official notice that formal charges had been filed with the Territorial Court, Thornton accusing Catherine of moral corruption, inappropriate conduct, and deliberately undermining the social order by encouraging women to abandon their proper domestic duties in favour of unseemly intellectual pursuits. The evidence Thornton presented was a collection of statements from townspeople who had observed West and Catherine alone together at night. The tutoring sessions that Catherine had thought were private, but which apparently several ranch hands and passing travellers had witnessed through the study windows, twisted now into something sordid and improper by Thornton's malicious interpretation. West's reaction when he read the charges was immediate and violent, his fist slamming into the wall hard enough to crack the plaster, and he was halfway to the door with murder in his eyes before Catherine caught his arm. "We fight this legally," she said firmly, though her own hands were shaking with rage and fear at what these charges could mean, not just for her employment, but for her entire future. "Violence will only prove Thornton right, will make us look guilty and out of control. We prove them wrong with truth and evidence and the law." West turned on her with frustration blazing in his grey eyes, his voice rough with barely controlled fury as he demanded to know how she could remain so calm and... Thornton was trying to destroy her reputation and drive her from Wyoming entirely. "I am not calm," Catherine replied, and her voice broke. Slightly on the words, "I am terrified that I will lose everything I have built here. The children who have become mine, the women who are finally claiming their right to education you. But terror is not an excuse for abandoning reason in favour of brute force." She moved closer to him, placing both hands on his chest where she could feel his heart pounding like a war drum beneath her palms. "We have truth on our side, we have the children's progress and the women's testimonies and the contract we signed that clearly establishes professional boundaries, and if we present our case with dignity and evidence rather than violence and emotion, we have a chance of winning this fight." Professor Harold Whitmore arrived in Coldwater like a spectre from Catherine's past life, stepping off the eastbound stage in a wool suit far too fine for frontier travel and a silk cravat that marked him as absurdly out of place among the working men and women of Wyoming. His thin face creased with the particular disapproval that came naturally to men who believed themselves intellectually superior to everyone around them. Catherine was in town collecting supplies when she saw him, her stomach dropping like a stone into cold water, and before she could retreat he had spotted her and was striding across the muddy street with complete disregard for his expensive boots. "My dear Catherine, I came as soon as I heard about this unfortunate scandal," he announced loudly enough that several townspeople turned to stare. "I am here to offer you an honourable escape from this predicament before your reputation is damaged beyond all repair." West had been loading feed sacks into the wagon, but he stopped at Harold's words, turning slowly to face the professor with an expression that would have warned a wiser man to choose his next words carefully. Harold, oblivious to the danger, continued, with the same condescending tone he had always used when discussing Catherine's work, explaining that while teaching ranch children their letters was admirable vulgarity that showed her good heart, she was clearly wasting her considerable intellect on endeavours far beneath her capabilities. He gestured dismissively at the dusty town around them, as though the entire territory of Wyoming was beneath his notice, and suggested that if she married him immediately, they could return to Boston, where he had arranged a position for her, managing the household of a prominent family, work more suited to her gender while still allowing her to feel useful. Catherine felt West move closer behind her, felt the heat of his anger radiating like a physical force, and she knew from the set of his shoulders that he was seconds away from committing violence that would only make their legal situation worse. She held up one hand to stop him without looking away from Harold, her voice when she spoke as cold and sharp as a January wind cutting down from the mountains. "Harold, I left Boston to escape exactly the kind of suffocating condescension you are demonstrating so perfectly right now, and I have found more genuine learning, more intellectual satisfaction, more purpose in one evening, here teaching women who hunger for knowledge, than I found in all my years suffering through your tedious lectures and patronizing advice." Harold's face flushed an ugly red, and he stuttered something about her being overwrought and not thinking clearly, about how frontier life had obviously affected her judgment. But Catherine continued with the same icy precision. "I am teaching advanced mathematics to an 11-year-old girl who will accomplish more in her lifetime than you ever will. I am helping women claim their right to education and self-determination. I am building something that matters rather than decorating drawing rooms and pretending my mind does not exist to make small men feel larger, and I would rather face whatever charges Thornton brings than spend one more moment in your presence." That night, after Harold had been sent packing back to his hotel in humiliation, and the children were asleep, West found Catherine in the study where she had been staring unseeing at a book for the past hour, her mind too chaotic to actually process the words on the page. "Catherine, we need to talk about the hearing, about what happens if Thornton wins," he began. And then, before she could respond, he dropped to one knee in a gesture so sudden and unexpected that her heart stopped beating entirely. "Marry me," he said simply, his grey eyes searching her face with desperate intensity. "Marry me, and all of Thornton's accusations become meaningless. We make this arrangement permanent and legal, and no one can question your moral character or my judgment." Catherine felt something shatter inside her chest, all the hope she had been carefully nurturing over the past months crumbling to dust. And when she spoke, her voice was cold with the particular fury that comes from profound disappointment. "You want to marry me to solve a legal problem, to make Thornton's charges go away, to save my reputation and protect your contracts, not because you actually want me as your wife." West stood abruptly, frustration flashing across his features as he ran one hand through his hair in a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of barely controlled emotion. "That is not what I said, Catherine. You are twisting my words into something ugly. When I am trying to what? Save me," she interrupted, standing to face him with her hands clenched at her sides. "I told you I will not be the woman who needs rescuing. I will not be married for propriety's sake or to solve problems, or because it is the convenient solution to an inconvenient situation. I have more respect for myself than that, even if you do not." West's face darkened, and he took a step closer, his voice rising to match hers as frustration gave way to genuine anger. "I have loved you for months, Catherine. Loved you since you pulled that foal into the world, covered in blood and laughing. Loved you when you defended Sarah's brilliance and taught Michael to read and made this house feel like a home instead of a mausoleum. But I did not speak because you made it abundantly clear that you wanted independence and professional boundaries and no romantic entanglement." Catherine felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall, refused to show weakness when her whole world was crumbling around her, and even this man she had started to trust was trying to trap her in the very cage she had fled Boston to escape. "If you truly loved me, you would not propose now when I am vulnerable and frightened and facing charges that could destroy everything I have built," she said, her voice shaking despite her attempts at control. "You would wait until I had my own power back, my own choices, instead of offering marriage when I am desperate, and might accept out of fear rather than genuine feeling." They stood facing each other across the study, both breathing hard, both too proud and too hurt to back down from positions they had taken in anger and fear. And Catherine saw the exact moment when West's expression closed off, when he withdrew behind walls as thick as the ones she had built around her own heart. "Fine," he said quietly, and the calm in his voice was somehow worse than his earlier anger. "I will not force my unwanted affections on you, Miss Hartwell, and I apologize for assuming you might welcome a proposal from a simple rancher when you clearly deserve someone of Professor Whitmore's intellectual caliber." The territorial hearing was held in the largest room available in Coldwater, the second floor of the town hall that normally served for dances and social gatherings, and every seat was filled with townspeople who had come to witness what promised to be the most entertaining spectacle the county had seen in years. Judge Morrison, no relation to the hotel clerk, presided from behind a borrowed desk, a stern man in his 60s with silver hair and a reputation for fairness that Catherine desperately hoped would prove accurate, though his expression as he surveyed the crowded room suggested he was already weary of the entire affair before it had even begun. Thornton presented his case with the smooth confidence of a man who believed righteousness was on his side, painting Catherine as a dangerous radical who corrupted decent women into abandoning their sacred duties as wives and mothers, who filled children's heads with ideas above their station that would make them dissatisfied with honest work, who lived in flagrant disregard of moral propriety under the same roof as a widowed man with no adequate supervision. He produced witnesses who testified to seeing Catherine and West alone together late at night, to hearing Catherine tell the secret women's group that they deserved the same educational opportunities as men, to watching Sarah Weston work mathematical equations that her witness claimed were unnatural for a girl to comprehend. Catherine listened to each accusation with outward calm, while inside she felt the walls closing in, felt the weight of all the times she had been told she was too much, too educated, too outspoken, too unwilling to accept her proper place. And when Judge Morrison finally asked if she wished to present a defense, she stood with her hand steady and her voice clear. She explained her educational philosophy with the same precision she had once used in academic papers, arguing that knowledge was not dangerous, but ignorance was. That teaching people to think critically made them better citizens rather than worse. That denying women education kept them helpless and dependent rather than virtuous and pure. She presented the children's work, Sarah's advanced mathematics and scientific observations, Michael's essays and poetry, Emma's reading progress that far exceeded expectations for her age, and she saw several people in the crowd nod with approval at the tangible evidence of her success. But Judge Morrison's expression remained troubled, his eyes returning again and again to Thornton's moral arguments, and when he questioned Catherine about the propriety of her living arrangements despite the contract she had signed, she felt her defense beginning to crumble, because how could she prove the absence of impropriety? How could she demonstrate that nothing inappropriate had occurred when the very act of a woman living independently was considered inappropriate by the men like Thornton? West had been sitting in the back of the room with his hands clenched on his knees, and when the judge asked if anyone else wished to testify on Miss Hartwell's behalf, he stood with such force that his chair scraped loudly against the wooden floor. West walked to the front of the room with the confidence of a man who had nothing left to lose, and when he took his place before the judge, something in his bearing changed, the rough frontier rancher falling away to reveal something else entirely beneath the weathered exterior. "Your Honour, my name is James Weston III. I was educated at Yale University, where I studied law and philosophy before the war interrupted my final year, and I come from one of the oldest banking families in Boston, a fact I mention only because it gives me intimate knowledge of men like Silas Thornton, who use social pressure and moral panic to control others and protect their own interests." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs, and Judge Morrison had to call for order, while Thornton's face went from red to purple, clearly blindsided by this revelation about West's background that explained so much about his elegant handwriting and his ability to debate philosophy and his comfort with complex contracts. West continued with the methodical precision of a lawyer presenting evidence, dismantling each of Thornton's accusations with facts and logic that left no room for emotional manipulation, pointing out that the contract between himself and Catherine specified separate quarters and professional boundaries that had been scrupulously maintained, that the tutoring sessions Thornton presented as evidence of impropriety had occurred in a room with windows that anyone could observe and had involved nothing more scandalous than discussions of literature and mathematics. He testified that Catherine's teaching had transformed his children in ways that went beyond simple academic progress, that Sarah had gone from hiding her intelligence to embracing it, that Michael had overcome struggles with reading that had made him believe he was stupid, that Emma had emerged from the frightened silence that had consumed her since her mother's death, and he presented examples of their work that made several people in the audience gasp with genuine admiration. When Thornton tried to interrupt with objections about the moral dangers of educating women beyond their station, West turned on him with controlled fury that was more devastating than any shouting could have been. "Mr. Thornton," Thornton speaks of moral corruption while he attempts to keep half the population ignorant and powerless, claims to protect social order while he uses economic coercion, to silence anyone who threatens his authority, wraps his fear of change in the language of propriety and tradition, because he knows that educated women will see through his manipulation and demand better for themselves and their children. West turned to address the entire room, his voice carrying to every corner with the authority of someone trained in rhetoric and public speaking. Gentlemen, you do not fear Miss Hartwell because she is improper or immoral or corrupting. You fear her because she is right, because she proves that women possess the same intellectual capabilities as men and deserve the same opportunities, and because once your wives and daughters receive the education she offers, they will begin to question why they have been denied it for so long and what other lies they have been told about their limitations and proper places. Before the murmuring from West's testimony could fully settle, Margaret Hayes rose from her seat near the middle of the room, her chin lifted with the same defiance Catherine had seen that first day at church, and one by one other women stood with her, until 20 ranch wives were on their feet facing the judge and their husbands, and the entire community that had taught them to stay silent and small. "Your Honour," Margaret said in a voice that trembled slightly but grew stronger with each word, "I would like to testify on behalf of Miss Hartwell, as would these other women who have benefited from her teaching and her courage in offering us what our own community denied us." Judge Morrison looked startled but gestured for her to continue, and Margaret walked to the front of the room where she explained that Catherine had been teaching the secret women's group for nearly a month, helping them learn not just basic literacy but mathematics and history, and the kind of critical thinking that allowed them to understand the world beyond their kitchens, and to recognize when they were being cheated or manipulated or lied to by men who assumed female ignorance was a virtue. One by one the women came forward with their testimonies, Beth Peterson explaining how Catherine had taught her to read medical texts that helped her save her youngest child from croup, Emma Rodriguez describing how learning mathematics had revealed her husband's business partner was embezzling from their ranch, Sarah Watson reading from a history book and explaining how understanding the past had given her hope for a different future. Each testimony built on the last until the courtroom buzzed with energy that felt dangerous and electric, and Catherine saw several husbands shifting uncomfortably in their seats as they realized their wives had been keeping secrets, had been claiming power they had never been granted permission to possess. Then Abigail Thornton stood, a woman Catherine had only seen from a distance at church, plump and greying and so thoroughly cowed by her husband that she seemed to exist only in his shadow, but now she walked to the front of the room with a book clutched in her trembling hands. Silas Thornton half rose from his seat, his face contorted with rage and humiliation, but Judge Morrison fixed him with a stare that could have frozen fire and ordered him to sit down and remain silent. "Mrs. Thornton," the judge said more gently, "do you wish to testify?" Abigail nodded and opened her book, a simple primer that children used to learn reading, and she began to read aloud in a halting voice that grew more confident with each word, her first time reading publicly after 40 years of signing her name with an X and pretending she understood documents her husband placed before her. When she finished the passage, she closed the book and looked directly at her husband, with an expression that held decades of suppressed anger finally finding voice. "My husband fears educated women because he knows we will see through his lies," she said clearly. "He knows that if I could read contracts, I would have discovered years ago that he has been stealing from our accounts, that if I understood finance, I would know he has mortgaged our home 3 times to cover his gambling debts, that if I had been educated, I never would have married him in the first place." Judge Morrison called for order repeatedly as the courtroom erupted after Abigail Thornton's devastating testimony, his gavel striking the desk like gunshots until the crowd finally settled into tense silence, and he sat for a long moment studying the papers before him, while everyone waited with barely contained anticipation for his verdict. The judge removed his spectacles and cleaned them with deliberate care, a gesture that seemed designed to increase the suspense, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of authority tempered by unexpected compassion for the difficulty of the situation before him. "I have heard testimony today that speaks to the best and worst of our territorial character," he began, looking around the room at faces ranging from hopeful to furious to terrified. "Mr. Thornton has presented concerns about moral propriety and social order that merit serious consideration in any civilized community, but what I have actually seen is evidence of exceptional teaching, of children who are struggling now thriving, of women who are kept ignorant now claiming their right to knowledge and self-determination." Judge Morrison turned his attention to Catherine, and she felt her heart hammering so hard she wondered if everyone could hear it, felt West's gaze on her from across the room like a physical touch. Miss Hartwell has presented a legally binding contract that specifies professional boundaries and separate living quarters, has demonstrated through tangible evidence that her teaching methods produce remarkable results, and has been defended by the very people who have benefited most from her presence in this community, he said, and I find no credible evidence of moral corruption or inappropriate conduct, only evidence of a woman doing exceptional work in the face of significant opposition from those who benefit from keeping others ignorant. The judge's next words cut through the courtroom like a blade, and Catherine saw Thornton's face begin to purple with impotent rage. Furthermore, I must criticise the school board for their rejection of Miss Hartwell based solely on her gender, rather than her qualifications, decision that deprived this community's children of an educator who clearly surpasses the man they hired in her place, and I would suggest that this territory needs more teachers like Catherine Hartwell, not fewer, if we hope to build a society worthy of statehood. Judge Morrison stood to deliver his final verdict, and the room held its collective breath. I find in favour of Miss Hartwell on all charges, declare that her employment arrangement with Mr. Weston is legal and proper, and furthermore suggest that Mr. Thornton consider carefully before bringing frivolous charges motivated by personal vendetta rather than legitimate legal concerns. As such, behaviour wastes the court's time and damages his own credibility. Catherine felt the tears of relief streaming down her face despite her attempts at composure, felt Margaret reach over to squeeze her hand, while other women wept openly at this validation of their right to learn and grow beyond the limitations society had placed on them. Across the courtroom, West was standing with an expression that held hope and question, and something that looked like love barely contained. And when their eyes met, Catherine felt her carefully constructed walls finally crumble completely, felt herself ready at last to risk the vulnerability she had been running from since Boston. Harold was waiting outside the courthouse when Catherine emerged, with the women still celebrating around her, his expensive suit looking even more ridiculous against the backdrop of jubilant ranch wives in their simple calico dresses, and he approached with the determined expression of a man who had not yet accepted defeat. "Catherine, you have proven your point spectacularly. You have shown these frontier people the value of education and female empowerment. But now it is time to return to civilization where you can do real academic work," he said, pulling an envelope from his coat pocket with a flourish. "I have secured you a position at the Wellesley Female Seminary in New York, teaching philosophy and literature to young women of good families, a position worthy of your intellect and education, rather than wasting yourself on ranch wives and frontier children who will likely never use what you teach them beyond basic survival needs." Catherine looked at the envelope without taking it, aware that West had emerged from the courthouse and was standing perhaps 20 feet away, close enough to hear this conversation but deliberately maintaining distance as though giving her space to make her own choice without his presence influencing her decision. The old Catherine, the woman who had fled Boston, might have been tempted by Harold's offer, by the validation of a prestigious position at a real institution, by the chance to prove herself in academic circles that had rejected her. But that woman no longer existed, and the life Harold offered seemed as appealing as a cage lined with velvet. "Harold, I am doing real work here," Catherine said clearly, her voice carrying across the courthouse steps where people were still filing out. "I am changing the lives of women who have been denied education their entire existence, teaching children who were told they were stupid or unnatural for their intelligence, building something that matters more than publishing papers that 3 other philosophers will read and critique." She stepped closer to him, wanting him to understand even though she knew he never truly would. "My answer is no, not just to you, but to everything you represent, to Boston and its suffocating propriety, to academic institutions that value credentials over actual impact, to making myself smaller and quieter and more acceptable to make small men feel comfortable in their unearned authority." Harold's face flushed, and he sputtered something about her throwing away her potential on people who could not appreciate it, on a life that would leave her isolated and forgotten rather than celebrated in intellectual circles. But Catherine was already turning away from him, already walking toward the life she had built, rather than the one she had been told she should want. West watched her approach with hope and vulnerability written plainly on his weathered face, and when Catherine reached him, she took his hand in front of the entire town, not caring what anyone thought, and said loud, enough for Harold and everyone else to hear, that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do, with exactly the people who valued her for who she truly was rather than who they wanted her to become. Catherine found West by the corral an hour after Harold's departure, the sun beginning its descent toward the mountains and painting everything in shades of gold that made the whole world look softened and forgiving. And when he turned at the sound of her footsteps, she saw in his face the same careful hope she felt blooming in her own chest. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble, moving to stand beside him at the fence where a young horse watched them with curious eyes. "I accused you of proposing from duty when the truth is I was terrified, afraid that if I let myself love you, I would lose myself again the way I almost lost myself in Boston, trying to become what others wanted me to be." West turned to face her fully, his hands gentle as they took hers, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a way that felt both natural and momentous. "Catherine, I do not want to possess you or reshape you or dim your brilliance to make myself feel more important," he said, his voice rough with emotion barely contained it. "I want to partner with you, to build a life where both of us can be fully ourselves without compromise or apology. Your mind and your strength and your passion, all the things that make you remarkable. That is what I love. I do not want you smaller or quieter or more conventional. I want you exactly as you are." Catherine felt tears streaming down her face and made no attempt to stop them. Felt something unlock in her chest that had been closed since the day her father disowned her, since the moment she realized that being herself meant being alone in a world that wanted women to be decorative rather than substantial. "Then ask me again," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Ask me to marry you, not to solve problems or save reputations, but because you love me and want to spend your life with me." West's expression transformed with understanding, and he dropped to one knee there in the dirt beside the corral with the evening light painting him golden. And this time his proposal held none of the desperate practicality of the first attempt, only honest emotion offered, without defence or pretense. "Professor Catherine Hartwell," he said, and she loved that he used her title like it was something to be honoured rather than hidden. "Will you marry me not to save your reputation or mine, not to silence Thornton or satisfy society or make anything easier, but because I love you with everything I am, and I believe that together we are better than either of us could be apart, because I want to spend every day arguing philosophy and teaching children and building something meaningful with the most remarkable woman I have ever known." Catherine pulled him to his feet and kissed him with all the passion she had been suppressing. For months, with all the love she had been afraid to claim, and when they broke apart they were both laughing and crying, and West was spinning her in a circle like they were dancing to music only they could hear. The wedding took place on a clear December morning at the Triple W Ranch, with the mountains rising purple and white behind them, and frost still sparkling on the grass like scattered diamonds, and Catherine had insisted on simplicity rather than spectacle, because this marriage was about truth rather than performance. She wore a dress of deep forest green that Margaret had helped her sew, the colour chosen deliberately because white seemed dishonest given that this was no innocent union of untried hearts, but a partnership between two people who had been broken by life and were choosing to build something stronger from the pieces. West stood waiting on the porch in his best suit with his silver-threaded hair combed back and his eyes full of emotions he no longer tried to hide, and when Catherine emerged from the house with Sarah at her side serving as maid of honour, his face transformed with wonder, as though he still could not quite believe this remarkable woman had chosen him. Sarah stood tall in her role, wearing a new dress that Catherine had insisted on buying, despite the girls' protests about extravagance, and her presence beside Catherine felt symbolic of everything they had accomplished. A brilliant young woman, claiming her right to stand proud rather than hiding her light to make others comfortable. Judge Morrison had agreed to officiate despite the unconventional nature of the ceremony, and he began with words that made several people in the small gathered crowd of supportive community members smile with understanding. "I must confess this is the first wedding I have performed where I am absolutely certain both parties are intellectual equals," he said, looking between Catherine and West with approval, "and I suspect their marriage will be far more interesting than most as a result of that equality." The vows they had written themselves were nothing like the traditional promises Catherine had heard at countless Boston weddings, no obedience or submission, or any suggestion that Catherine would become West's property rather than his partner. West spoke first, his deep voice carrying clearly in the cold morning air as he promised to respect Catherine's mind and support her work, to encourage her growth rather than trying to contain it, to argue with her when they disagreed and learn from her when she was right, to be a partner in building a life that honoured both their strengths and accepted both their weaknesses. Catherine's vows matched his in honesty and depth, promising to build with him rather than for him, to challenge him to grow while growing herself, to value his wisdom even when it differed from hers, to create a marriage based on choice renewed daily rather than obligation accepted once and endured forever. When Judge Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, the small crowd erupted in genuine celebration, the women from the secret study group cheering loudest of all, and West kissed Catherine with a passion that would have scandalized proper Boston society, but which felt perfectly right here among people who valued authenticity over appearance. The community school opened its doors in late spring, funded by territorial government money that arrived after Judge Morrison's written recommendation cited Catherine's case as evidence that Wyoming Territory needed to invest in quality education regardless of teacher gender. And Catherine stood before her first official class of 20 students ranging from 6 to 14 with a satisfaction that went deeper than any academic achievement she had earned in Boston. West had taken to teaching evening classes for adults 3 nights a week, his Yale education finally put to use in ways that felt meaningful rather than ornamental. And their home had become a gathering place for people hungry for knowledge and debate, the parlour often filled with ranchers arguing philosophy and ranch wives discussing history, while children worked mathematics problems at the kitchen table. Sarah was preparing to sit for early university admission examinations that would allow her to enter at 15 rather than 18, her brilliance no longer hidden but celebrated, and she had announced her intention to study engineering, despite warnings that no university would accept a female student in such a masculine field. To which Catherine had responded that Sarah would simply have to be the first to change their minds. The secret women's group now met openly every Tuesday afternoon in the community school building, 25 members strong and growing, their husbands having learned after the trial that attempting to suppress female education only resulted in public humiliation and domestic discord. Catherine was 6 months pregnant and still teaching despite West's concerned hovering and Molly's predictions that she would exhaust herself, but she refused to slow down because women had been having babies while working since the beginning of time, and she saw no reason to treat pregnancy like an illness rather than a natural condition. That evening she sat in their favourite chairs by the fire with her swollen feet propped in West's lap while he massaged them with gentle hands, and they quizzed each other on Kant's categorical imperative the way other couples might discuss weather or gossip, their intellectual partnership as strong as their romantic one. She reflected on the journey that had brought her here, how she had boarded that train in Boston running away from everything that had tried to diminish her, from her father's disappointment and Harold's condescension and a society that wanted women decorative rather than substantial, but somewhere along the way she had stopped running from and started running towards these children who needed her and these women who valued her and this man who loved her, not despite her brilliance but because of it. "You know," West said suddenly, "you were right that first day in front of the hotel." Catherine looked at him with raised eyebrows, her mind sorting through everything that had happened in those first chaotic moments. "About what specifically? Because I seem to recall being right about several things." West laughed and pulled her feet closer, his thumbs working the arch with practiced skill. "You were not here to be anyone's wife, you were here to be exactly who you are, a brilliant educator and philosopher and force of nature who was never going to let anyone make her smaller. I just got lucky enough that you chose to be my wife too without sacrificing any of who you are." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes, the pregnancy making her more emotional than usual, and she reached out to cup his face with one hand. "Professor Weston, that is the smartest thing you have said all day." "I learned from the best," he replied, leaning forward to kiss her with the same passion that had marked their wedding day 6 months ago. And she kissed him back with gratitude for this life she had built, this family she had claimed, this love she had finally been brave enough to accept.